They called it madness, turning a steam locomotive around so its flat-faced cab led the way straight into the dark heart of America's deadliest tunnels. For decades, critics mocked the Southern Pacific's backwards engine. Crews on the Sierra Nevada's Donna Pass were trapped in 140-degree cabs, choking on exhaust with nowhere to run, 10,000 feet above sea level, under 40 feet of snow. When the railroad rewrote every rule and pushed the cab to the front, it wasn't just about engineering, it was about breathing or dying. How did a design so condemned end up saving lives when nothing else worked? Donna Pass sits more than 7,000 feet above the valley floor, carved through the granite backbone of the Sierra Nevada. This stretch is infamous not just for its deadly winters, but for the way the railroad tried to fight them, mile after mile of wooden snowsheds built to shield the tracks from avalanches and drifts that could bury a train in minutes. Engineers and laborers used millions of board feet of timber to create a continuous roof, stretching nearly 40 miles along the summit. Every winter, storms dumped up to 40 feet of snow here. The sheds were the only way to keep the line open, transforming the mountain into a fortress of wood and steel. But these defenses came with a hidden cost. The snow sheds did not just keep out snow, they trapped everything else inside. Smoke from steam engines, hot exhaust, and cinders had nowhere to escape. The sheds turned the railroad into a single unbroken flue. Instead of open air, trains entered a tunnel that sometimes ran for miles, where the darkness pressed in and the only light came from the orange glow of the firebox. The walls and roof, built to save trains from the mountain, instead formed a perfect trap for heat and fumes. This was not a place built for comfort or safety. It was a place where the mountain's fury was matched by the railroad's stubbornness, a place where the very structures meant to protect could just as easily suffocate. The sheds held back the snow, but they also held in the danger. Inside those sheds, breathing felt like punishment. Crews described the air as thick as syrup, stinging every breath, the taste of sulfur clinging to their tongues. The temperature in the cab could spike to 140 degrees. Hot enough that sweat soaked through uniforms in minutes, hot enough to blur vision and make metal tools burn to the touch. Engineers wrapped wet rags over their faces, hoping to filter out the black smoke, but nothing kept the fumes from clawing at their lungs. Some tried crude respirators, but the smoke pressed in through every crack. Eyes burned, throats closed, and sometimes men simply slumped over at the throttle, overcome by the heat and the poison. There are stories of engineers passing out mid-run, of firemen dragging their partners out of the cab just in time. The railroad kept records of men lost to the mountain, but most of the suffering went unreported, just another day on the line. The legacy of Donna Pass hung over every trip. This was the same stretch where the Donner Party had been trapped by snow, where survival was never guaranteed. Now a new generation faced a different kind of death, one that came not from cold, but from the very machines meant to protect them. The mountain demanded a price, and the old engines were paying it in sweat, blood, and breath. Conventional mallet locomotives were monsters of their age, double engines hinged together, with the cabin crew perched at the very rear, just in front of the tender. This layout made sense on open tracks, but inside the snow sheds, it became a death trap. The boiler stretched out ahead, then the firebox, then the cab, and finally the tender trailing behind, loaded with coal or oil. The problem was geometry. The smokestack stood right up front, so every puff of exhaust shot directly into the path the train was moving. When a mallet entered a tunnel or snowshed, the smoke had nowhere to go but backwards, straight into the cab where men were trying to see, breathe, and stay alive. Running these engines in reverse was no better. The tender, a massive tank of fuel and water, blocked the engineer's view of the track and all the signal posts along the line. On the Sierra, missing a signal could mean disaster. The mallet's own length made things worse. The articulated frame twisted through mountain curves, but the cab at the rear was still boxed in, with the tender looming like a wall. Even with the engine facing backwards, the only thing crews saw ahead was a blank sheet of steel and the glint of rails disappearing into darkness. No amount of wet rags or clever tricks could fix this. The very design of the mallet forced the crew to ride behind the smoke, behind the heat, behind the danger. As long as the exhaust led the way, every trip through Donna's sheds was a gamble with suffocation. The mountain did not care about horsepower or engineering pride. It punished any design that put men behind the monkey. Every crew tried to outsmart the mountain in their own way, but nothing worked for long. Wet rags soaked in water from the tender were tied around mouths and noses, meant to strain out the soot, but after a few minutes, the cloth turned black and heavy, offering little more than a false sense of safety. Some men carried makeshift respirators, cobbled together from bits of rubber hose or even flour sacks, hoping to breathe through layers of damp fabric. The railroad experimented with commercial gas masks, but the filters clogged fast, and the straps cut into faces slick with sweat. In the worst stretches, the air inside the cab was so thick that lanterns glowed a sickly orange and the rails vanished ahead. Engineers logged runs where visibility dropped to just a few feet, the signals lost in a haze of smoke so dense it felt like swimming. When the train stalled, everything spiraled. Oxygen thinned and the temperature in the cab spiked. Crews tried to fan the air with their hats or wave open the cab doors, but the only thing that moved was the smoke. Some firemen kept logs of how many times they had to drag a partner out of the cab, half-conscious, gasping for air. Over the years, the railroad's own records show a trail of failed attempts: new vent hoods, extra fans, even running the engines backwards. But every fix was a bandage on a wound that would not close. The mountain kept demanding more, and the old tricks kept falling short. The men knew they were running out of options. Something fundamental had to change, or the mountain would keep claiming its price. Turning a steam locomotive around sounds simple until you look at what is actually inside. With coal-fired engines, the fireman stands right behind the boiler, shoveling coal from the tender straight into the firebox. If you put the cab at the front and the tender at the back, the distance becomes impossible. No one can shovel coal through 70 feet of twisting, vibrating steel, especially with the whole train climbing a mountain. That is why the Sierra solution only worked with oil. Oil changed everything. Instead of shoveling, a pump pressurized the heavy fuel back in the tender, sending it through a pipe that snaked the full length of the engine, more than 70 feet, right up to the burners in the firebox at the very front. The oil was thick, almost like tar, so it needed to be heated and kept under pressure, even when the locomotive was climbing a 2% grade or rattling around a mountain curve. The plumbing was a headache. Pipes had to bend and flex with the articulated frame, never leaking, never bursting, even as the engine twisted through the granite canyons of Donna Pass. Every joint had to hold under vibration and torque, while the oil was being pushed and heated along that long run. Southern Pacific engineers worked out a system that used 5 pounds of air pressure in the oil tank, enough to keep the fuel moving forward no matter how steep the climb. Steam heated the oil so it would flow, and special atomizing burners sprayed it into the firebox. The fireman could stand up front, next to the engineer, controlling everything with a set of valves instead of a shovel. This meant the cab could finally move to the very front, with the crew breathing clean air and the smoke trailing harmlessly behind them. No other railroad in the country tried this at scale. Oil was cheap and plentiful in California, and the Southern Pacific faced mountains that demanded a radical fix. The entire design, the flat face, the long plumbing, the cab forward layout, only made sense because oil could be pumped, not shoveled. Oil was the key that unlocked the mountain. Southern Pacific's leadership faced a crossroads in 1909. The old tricks had failed, and men were still choking in the snowsheds. No one wanted to be the one to sign off on something that looked like a prank: a locomotive with its cab at the very front, the boiler trailing behind, and the smokestack at the rear. But desperation has a way of making bold ideas sound reasonable. The MC-1 prototype was ordered from Baldwin that year, a 4662 mallet. Built not for tradition, but for survival. Oil fuel made the flip possible, but the rest was a leap of faith. The design meeting became a battleground of priorities. Some pointed to Italian experiments with smoke deflection, But this was uncharted territory in the United States. The MC-1 would be the first of its kind here. Critics inside and outside the company did not hold back. They called it a freak, a backwards beast. The biggest fear was not about the plumbing or the firebox, it was about what happened in a crash. With the cab leading the way, the crew would be first to hit any obstacle, a rock slide, a runaway car, a stalled train. There was no boiler to act as a shield, just a thin wall of steel and glass between the crew and disaster. But the men who had spent years gasping for air in the tunnels did not hesitate. They knew what it meant to have the monkey off their backs, to run with the smoke trailing behind instead of pouring into their lungs. They accepted the risk up front, better to take their chances with the mountain than to suffocate in the dark. The decision was not made in a boardroom. It was hammered out in the cab by men who had seen what the old ways cost. 15 more cab forwards followed the MC-1, each one a little better than the last. Southern Pacific did not wait for perfect. They committed to the experiment, betting that the strangest-looking engine on the rails would become the only one fit to conquer Donner Pass. The era of the cab forward had begun, not because it was pretty, but because it was the only thing that worked. The first time a cab forward hit the grade at Donner, the mountain met its match. The crew sat at the very front, nothing but glass and steel between them and the world. For the first time in decades, they could see every curve, every signal, every drift of snow blowing across the rails. It felt like flying above the track, the boiler and fire trailing behind. The old suffocating darkness was gone, and the smoke, the monkey, finally stayed off their backs. These engines were not just different, they were powerful in a way the mountain had never seen. The AC-12 class, the most advanced of the fleet, could push out nearly 6,000 horsepower. That meant trains a mile long, loaded with fruit, lumber, and war supplies, climbed the Sierra without stalling, even on grades that reached 2% or more. Where older mallets choked and faltered, the cab forwards just kept moving, their drivers pounding out a steady rhythm through the granite canyons. The crews called it a revelation. One engineer wrote that visibility was so good you could check both sides of the track without leaving your seat. No more guessing where the rails disappeared into smoke, no more squinting for signals through a haze of soot. The cab stayed cool, the air was clean, and the only thing following the train was its own exhaust, streaming harmlessly out the back. The monkey, that old enemy, was finally behind them. Railroaders who had spent years coughing and sweating in the old cabs now fought over assignments on the cab forwards. They knew the risks. If a rock slide or a runaway car blocked the track, they would be the first to hit it. But for men who had spent their lives running from smoke, nothing could match the freedom of breathing easy at the head of a 400-ton machine. On Donner Pass, the cab forward was not just a machine. It was the first breath of fresh air in 40 years. By the early 1950s, the mountain's old enemy, smoke, was no longer the main threat on Donner Pass. Diesel locomotives arrived, and with them came a new kind of silence. These new engines did not choke their crews with fumes or fill the snowsheds with heat. They simply hummed and pulled, indifferent to the tunnels and the snow. The cab forwards, once the kings of the Sierra, found themselves out of work almost overnight. Southern Pacific had built 256 cab forwards in total, each one a lifeline for the men who ran them. But the very things that made them special, the flat face, the oil plumbing, the backwards design, also made them impossible to sell or repurpose. No other railroad wanted a locomotive that only made sense on a mountain lined with 40 miles of snowsheds. So one by one, the cab forwards were cut up for scrap. In the end, only a single survivor escaped the torch. Southern Pacific 4294, the last cab forward ever built, rolled off the Baldwin Locomotive Works assembly line in 1944. For a few short years, it hauled freight over the summit, its windows staring straight into the teeth of the Sierra. When the diesels took over, 4294 was retired and set aside. It sat silent while its sisters were dismantled, a relic in a world that had moved on. Today, Southern Pacific 4294 stands in Sacramento, preserved at the California State Railroad Museum. Its paint is faded, its pipes cold, but the flat face still looks out with the same steady gaze. The cab is empty now, but the story lingers in the steel and glass, a monument to the crews who chose risk over suffocation, and to a machine that conquered the deadliest tunnels by doing everything backwards. Of all the cab forwards that once roared over Donner Pass, only this one remains, a silent witness to an era when survival meant rewriting the rules. Today, only one cab forward survives. It is a monument to risk and defiance, and to the lives saved by daring to overturn tradition. As automation and efficiency shape modern engineering, the real test remains. Will we still choose human safety over convention when the stakes are highest? Sometimes progress means putting the future ahead of pride. What would you risk for a breath of fresh air? Share your thoughts in the comments.